questions out on the table, and I think we will see those questions threading their way through the afternoon. This is a very rich panel. We will be talking about times of protest as well as complexities of locating and describing resistance and its effects in various locations. We'll be starting with Michal Osterweil from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill.
Hi, so I'm trying to keep to time. Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to not be as polite as usual because he's going to be ruthless. He told us. So my title is up here, From Movements to Moments, Taking Other Worlds and Other Temporalities Seriously. The texts up here are really just to help because I'm going to be talking a lot and I want some things for you to just be able to read. So we are a movement. This is not a moment. A movement, not a moment, was one of the repeated mantras of the Forward Together Moral Mondays movement that brought North Carolina to the world attention as a site where the right wing had taken over both legislative houses and the governorship, was cutting social programs and spending at record speed, and where tens of thousands of people were taking to the streets in opposition. You might have heard of it. Reverend Barber, who is the president of the state's NAACP and the movement's self-appointed leader and spokesperson, repeated this phrase, "We are a movement, this is not a moment," often in his rousing sermon-like speeches. But for me, Reverend Barber's insistence that this was a movement, not a moment, seemed to be an almost direct response to the short-lived visibility of Occupy Wall Street and other protest movements that had turned the names of many of the world's city squares into shorthand for uprising. In this, his rejection of the positivity in the temporal register of momentness posed a striking contrast with the hope for a Tahrir moment declared by Adbusters in their July 2011 article, a hope I think that was intentional and that I believe is shared in many ways by this research convocation. So the question becomes why? At first glance, his opposition makes perfect sense. Who wouldn't rather be a movement than a moment? Movements are big, they endure, they are world-changing. Moments are, well, they're moments. They're brief, episodic, temporary, fleeting. This implies that they do not last, they do not endure, or they do not, it would seem, build lasting change. And not surprisingly, according to many standards of measure, many from contentious politics, and we won't get into that now, can probably be considered a more successful social change project. But there's something here precisely in this temporal difference, the normative favor we tend to pay to the bigger, to the more enduring movements, that I believe can help us lend clarity to the first set of questions unifying this research project. Questions that for me have everything to do with how we understand, and often, perhaps more often, misunderstand the political and ontological natures of many contemporary social movements. So most of us are right now familiar with dismissals of Occupy Wall Street for failing, we just heard one, being fleeting, being ineffectual. Such criticisms are perhaps best captured in statements like, "It will be an asterisk in the history books if it gets a mention at all." Both during its heyday and since its displacement from Zuccotti Park, OWS has been decried for failing to achieve substantial change or having any real political impact. Like the global justice movement before it, Occupy was criticized for many of the qualities participants in OWS seemed so proud of. Its lack of clear demands, its heterogeneous constituents, its prioritization of form, horizontality, assemblies, working groups, and deliberately avoiding clear demands over content. Its refusal of leaders, wariness of electoral politics, and its emphasis on play, performance, and fun. In fact, many critics have said, it's all play and no power. These criticisms become all the more fascinating given that not long before all of these declarations of failure, journalists, researchers, and activists alike were buzzing with excitement about the return of social movements, the recommencement of history. So you might remember that Time magazine named the Protester Person of the Year when they wrote, protesters in 2011 didn't just voice their complaints, they changed the world, hearkening back to the period before the end of history, they actually write this, when protesters were prime makers of history. So it's interesting, how did these movements change the world and become an asterisk in the history books in such a short time span? And this was not the first time I had watched a protest movement captivate people's imagination, serve as a moment after which nothing could be the same, and then, within a few years, sometimes even less, be considered negligible. So my goal in this paper, which is a much shorter paper than what I already did, which is already part of a larger book project, so we'll see how it goes, is to argue that the discussions of winning and losing, success and failure, characterizing current assessments of debates about, and strategy discussions for movements, both from critics and participants, are not getting us very far. They are themselves missing out precisely because they fail to realize that these opposing pairs, win-lose, fail-succeed, and others, are part of an epistemic culture and political ontology dominated by dualisms, a one-world view of political possibility, and a linear temporality. So, saying this differently, the argument I want to make here is that a large part of the reason that movements like Occupy, Seattle, Tahrir, etc. are appreciated, lauded, proclaimed to be world-changing at one instance, and then shortly thereafter become illegible, invisible, declared failed, at times by the same people that celebrated them, has to do with the fact that we are failing to register the planes of reality, including, importantly, the distinct temporalities at which they are working. So this, in turn, and this speaks to our relationship to movement, requires recognizing that the interpretive frameworks used by activists and analysts alike are themselves involved in whether or not these movements' true effects are registered. And therefore, whether their achievements happen, whether they're seen. In this, I believe we must recognize that even many of us who are intellectually committed to or believe in what I'll get into in the notion of ontological multiplicity often fail to really take these other worlds, these other ontologies seriously. So in what follows, I'm going to pick up on a few points of my larger paper, and to do this I'm going to begin by more fully articulating this political problem of interpretation as I see it, a problem I'll talk about as the problem of political realism. I then go on to argue that we must reframe our understandings of these movements as a matter of ontological politics and difference, in which affectivity is understood at a more micro-political and molecular level. Okay. So this is the second part, taking other worlds seriously and the problem of political realism. This paper is in part a response to this problem of political realism. And by political realism, I mean a few things. First, the tendency to always opt for the more strategic, expedient, credible option. That is, voting for a candidate you don't believe in, because the more radical option is unrealistic. It is unwinnable. Or perhaps less obvious, the argument that one needs to support a campaign at the level of the UN to set 1.5 degrees as the maximum, rather than participating in direct actions or working to shift cultural understandings, because these are just symbolic and have no real chance of making a real difference. Second, and closely related, is the assumption that certain sites of politics are more real than others. All of these tend to also depend on the idea of the effect or impact as visible, if not measurable. While I am empathizing with the concerns that have called, and part of this comes from my watching starting around 2009 with the COP15 events in the Conference of Parties in Copenhagen. Throughout the event and the months surrounding the climate summit, I kept hearing statements like the ultra-globalization movement had failed. We had been wrong. And it was a we. The cycle of struggle was over. We had been wrong because of our prioritizing of form over content and all the things that I was mentioning earlier. Moreover, people actually use the language of we need to get real. We need to become a more unified, strategic, and massive social movement for something clear. The implicit suggestion was the ultra-globalization movement hadn't been. That is, that it had not been for something, and that maybe it had not been real. Practically, this meant abandoning many of the signature components and methods that many of us have talked about as the hallmarks of this ultra-globalization movement. So while I empathize with these concerns, especially compelled by the sense of urgency climate change and various crises pose for us, this turn to what I call political realism is very concerning. Not only because I believe it's empirically wrong, but also because it is precisely in this diagnosis that we are failing to understand the register, or the way that these movements had and continue to work and succeed without using the fail dualism. So obviously I already talked about how we heard very similar arguments about the Occupy movement. And more recently I listened to a speech by one of the spokespersons for Podemos in Spain, speaking of the success of Podemos and suggesting that if anything were to be learned from the recent movements, it was the importance of abandoning the autonomist, change the world without taking power visions of social movements in favor of a more traditional political formation that could win elections. Now, I actually don't want to comment on Podemos. I think it's a very interesting political articulation in Spain. I'm more interested in the way it's being narrated. So, in fact, the same person in a semi-private conversation also explained to me that the Zapatistas were evidence of this failure. They had failed because of their choice to not support López Obrador and because they had remained small, local, and limited to Chiapas. My mouth dropped internally. Seriously, the Zapatistas had failed? So one of the reasons such false assessments are being made is because many of these calls for getting more politically realistic are premised on a false trade-off between realism, a combination of naive positivism, and what many of these critics are calling micropolitics. The latter, so micropolitics, is being wrongly differentiated from real politics and seen as not real, and then treated as less significant than traditional macropolitical sites. The opposition is problematic for a number of reasons, and I'm not going to give a lecture on Deleuze, but fundamentally because it fails to recognize that micropolitics are very real, and that they in fact offer and are premised on an expanded version of reality rather than a reduced one. So micropolitics is not seeking to replace macropolitics, but it is seeking to work without the limited political foci of, So the question of realism or realisticness is not unique to climate change. I've already gone over that. And I really do get why people make these. It's why people told me to vote for not vote for Nader, why I did vote for Obama twice. But what I want to say is that we have to recognize that at some level this is a self-fulfilling prophecy, and that we might be falling prey to what Pignard and Stengers refer to as infernal alternatives. These are what capitalism and modernity actually thrive on. If, in the last instance, the dominant terrain of the political is seen as the only one that counts, we will never substantiate or enervate the fabric of other possible outcomes or reals. So I'm not saying that we should categorically avoid the state or the more tangible and visible, but I'm just saying that we have to not reduce the site of politics to these. So to address this, we need to reframe the question first by explaining that what is at stake in these recent movements is not a political failure, but rather a failure to understand the true register at which these politics are working, a level or matter of different realities or ontologies coming up against the limits of the other, or a matter of what a colleague calls ontological conflict. And, So according to Mario Blasser, and this is the next part of the paper, the present moment can be fruitfully understood as marked by increasingly visible and generalized ontological conflicts that are associated with the struggle to shape the global age as an alternative to, rather than a continuation of modernity. Ontological conflicts are central to the times because they reveal the alternatives to modernity do exist, and because they force modernity to reshape itself in order to deal with radical difference. So ontological conflicts are in large part triggered by forcefully making other ontologies fit into modernity's categories. So while many continue to explain the alter-globalization movement and perhaps Occupy as being opposed to neoliberalism and corporate capitalism, I think a more complete understanding of their actions must recognize that they are involved in a critique of or conflict with modernity, or what we can call with Escobar liberal capitalist modernity. There's a lot more to say about this, and if I have time, I'll talk about how Mario defines the modern ontology. But I want to just talk about the implications, because recognizing the ontological dimension of these politics has profound implications. Here, it's useful to, you kind of have the whole thing up there. It's useful to consider this definition of ontology. Any way of understanding the world makes assumptions about what kinds of things do or can exist, and what might be their conditions of existence, relations of dependency. You can read it. So the political implications of recognizing that our own ontology determines what kinds of entities can and do exist are substantial, because what happens when we start to recognize that the things that exist for us politically, states, citizens, corporations, movements, NGOs, those things that can exist in our own ontology are not natural, universal, or immutable. In mainstream social movement studies, movements are conceived as political givens, neutral and expected parts of any modern political order. They can't call that political order or the notion of reality implicit in it into question. So this also has tremendous consequences for how we understand change, politics, political outcomes, emancipation. And in fact, returning to the question I set out with, it's precisely the failure to recognize that what is at stake takes place and requires living up to an expanded understanding of reality and realism, where different textures, and I just want you to, this notion of textures and consistencies, compose real entities that I believe many of our misunderstandings of the potential and power of the Tahrir moments lie. So when we start to realize that we are speaking at this register, we must also realize that this is not simply a battle taking place on a terrain and topography we already understand, a terrain filled with familiar actors. Rather, what we are dealing with is our different worlds and entities actually fighting to exist, both ontologically and conceptually. So where we are faced with a political terrain potentially comprised of different kinds of assemblages, intensities, flows, forces. And while states and all of the other entities we are used to dealing with will certainly be there, the success or victory of these other politics don't necessarily register at that. They might register at a different strata and involve other entities that we don't yet have, and this is referring to another part of the paper, the glasses to see or name. In this view, political outcomes themselves look very different. They don't necessarily follow linear models of cause and effect, and they are likely to unfold according to very different temporalities. So there's a lot more, but I'm going to just end there, and I know it's hopefully a provocative paper and speaks to a lot of the things, so hopefully we can pick up that stuff. And I apologize for it being so theoretical and not empirical, but time is very limited.
Thank you, Michal. We'll now have Paul Amar from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and he'll be speaking about the street, the sponge, and the ultra in Egypt.
Okay. Yes. All right, so I'm thrilled to be here at a Tahrir Moment gathering. Very excited. I am glad that we get to have a round-the-world conversation on this panel, and that I have my favorite partner in crime here, Zakia, to represent the Middle East in the house for this presentation. So yeah, I gotta move on, plunge right in. Today, as you know, the Nobel Peace Prize was announced to Malala Yousafzai and to Kailash Satyarthi for their activism around children's rights and children's empowerment. Malala, of course, was an activist on her own since the age of 10, and they attempted to assassinate her for her activism at the age of 13. So she is a very good example of exactly what I'm going to be talking about, and it transitions very well from the last paper, because this is all about basically after someone who lived in Egypt for most of the period between 2011 and 2013, and who has constantly been back and forth to Brazil, where I also work and do research during the protests of 2013-2014. I've been also interested in what is illegible about other kinds of protests and other kinds of spaces, other kinds of maybe not even protest actors, but resistance actors that maybe actually cause more change, or at least cause more state response than those visible in Tahrir Square, than those seen as anarchist or as Occupy tactic resistance actors that were hyper-visibilized by the media. And I want to look at other actors that fit into larger meta-narratives circulating transcontinentally about change and resistance. So one of those that didn't appear in my book, The Security Archipelago, which is on Brazil and Egypt, militarization and resistance around securitization regimes, but was constantly, literally occupying my lobby, stopping me from getting to Tahrir Square, constantly stopping the metro and interrupting other social movements in Egypt during the period I was there, and has, of course, many, many times been a part of Brazilian street politics in the 3 or 4 years I lived in Brazil, were mass children's movements or mass children's occupations and public presence in spaces that I'm trying now to deal with in ways that interrogate these illegibilities of these forms of infantile political sovereignty as they challenge logics of authoritarian securitization. I'll try to highlight some of the key points in the few minutes I have here. First, what I'm trying to do is provide an alternative counter-reading to the readings of youth and the generational dimension of many of the uprisings around the Arab Spring, and then bringing this transnationally eventually also to look at movements recently amongst children and in the United States and in Brazil. But of course we know that for that brief moment in which there was a kind of global consensus that we're going to celebrate the Arab Spring, from the left to the right to everyone in between, right? They were focusing on youth. Youth being 20s to 30-somethings years old. At this point, I was the chair of the board of the youth initiative for the Open Society Foundation. So me, 45 years old, I was like Mr. Youth. So, youth was the thing. And youth was kind of anybody who could kind of rock and roll in the streets. And, it was but it was not children. It was university age plus. They were specifically tied to a particular liberal imagination of a certain notion of diversity, but that wasn't grounded in meta-narratives of class. It was grounded in micro-narratives of personal, entrepreneurial, creative sociabilities, creative and even anarchic sociabilities, but not meta-structures of class or even of generation, really. It wasn't like 1968 in the same way, for example. It was about individual creativity, sociabilities, and new high-tech. And it was very much mirroring discourse in which we are them, they are us. You can take a person from Oakland wearing a face covering protesting police and blur her on the cover of another Time cover so that it almost looked like a woman wearing a hijab in Cairo protesting. It was a mirroring discourse in which the differences between these protest movements were blurred, but in which it was safe to celebrate because they were youth, not children, not those adults in the crony apparatuses of the state. They were individuals working on new media, which our global economy, meaning the United States global economy, could champion as a vehicle out of the recession, etc. And the target was to protest a dictator rather than to protest the system itself. This is the way it's represented in discourse. Again, it's rather still illegible what actually was the generational or the kind of age groupings and the values of those most radical elements in some of these movements on the ground. So what I wanted to look that then rose in 2013 and now more in 2014, another model about young people, now younger people, as in a sense the absolute opposite of what their older brothers and sisters represented 2 years ago. And this has become the new model of the failed future, of the quote-unquote failed revolutions of the protest era in South America and of the Arab Spring era in the Middle East. So you have a Guardian cover photo of a Yemeni child protester, but representing again this kind of loose children and the lost hope of the future in the Arab Spring models. You have within discourse itself, within the Arab world, you have a return to an obsession with loose children, with lost generation, with street children, with rampaging images of rampaging criminalized children, who again kind of become, in this perverse way, the opposite of what then their idealized older brothers and sisters represented. Now these are both, I'm talking about representations here, and I want to go beyond that to talking about the political economies and the particular sociabilities of children as real actors, and how in fact they always were and continue to be actually in some ways much more interesting than their slightly older brothers and sisters that I was so engaged with during the youth moment of 2011 and 12. So youth today, children, not youth, children meaning somewhere from age 8 to 18. Of course, all these things are very subjective, but we're meaning not university age agents in public have become, for reasons which I continue to think about over the last just year or so, constantly the theme of the most monstrous political, militarized police and security attacks across the world. We've had this, of course, the crisis over immigration, the kind of racial crisis of a few months ago, driven by children who were migrating themselves, who were moving to threaten the U.S. border, and you had Governor of Texas with his big phallic weapons pointed basically at small children, and this discourse of the child then as placing themselves at the border as both an attack and a defense. You have this happen during, of course, the war on Gaza, in which you had this obsession with children placing themselves as human shields, so therefore they could become legitimate targets, not just exceptional targets, but primary targets in both the representation and the real casualties of this war. So it's extraordinary, but this so we can imagine, okay, this is a perverse shift in racial militarized politics of a current moment, or we can, perhaps for provocation or perhaps for real reasons, look back a couple of years and take seriously that actually children have been organized quite seriously, and that children have been actually organizing in ways that do pose a threat. A threat, meaning in a good way, to the regimes of militarization, securitization, repressive regimes in the region and on the global order. The children leading protests in Gaza and in Bethlehem were, over the last 2 years, constantly the direct targets of repressive, incredibly violent forms of repression long before the attack on Gaza. Children are the primary actors in leading these protests. And I don't mean children meaning 19-year-olds. I mean children meaning 9 and 10, 11, 12-year-olds. We know that the Syrian uprisings of 2011 were started by children, who were writing graffiti and rising up against the police in Syria. We've forgotten them now that we're talking about jihadis and ISIS and the Kurds. But the original uprising was led not by children working as proxies for others, but by children. So why this is constantly, again, even in my own work in Brazil and Egypt, it's constantly been like, oh yeah, well there's children protesting and mobilizing around my building and around my life, and not always, and in very unruly ways, which of course aren't ideologically streamlined or packaged, but that I didn't read in consistent ways until forced to by these patterns, these monstrous political representations of children that just could not be ignored this year. So I want in this new project to look at the continuation, but also diverging a bit from my last project on militarized humanitarian war as a way of life in the global order, to look particularly at children as illegible workers, as illegible authors of new forms of sociality, and why that the sexualization of any child who speaks as a worker or as an author of public sociability becomes sexually criminalized, and why any academic, which often happens to be queer academics, who take very seriously the way children author their own lives as workers and as authors of alternative forms of sociability and resistance, why they're often sexually criminalized as sex predators when they do so. I'm going to talk about this when I finally get to Egypt now. Okay, so in Egypt, we've had, in the last year, a cycle of, now that I've reached the introduction to my paper, I have 5 more minutes. Okay, so let me just point to a couple really important moments here. In June 2014, we had 2 interesting articles appear which represented these 2 clashing paradigms of thinking about children and politics. We had Juan Cole's editorial in the New York Times, I believe it was, in which he talked about there's still hope for the tech-savvy Facebook generation of the Arab youth, that maybe implying that somehow getting rid of the brotherhood in Egypt allows them a second chance, or maybe not. It's a little bit blurry, but basically like we need to return to this positive discourse of the potential of the Arab, liberal, tech-savvy Arab youth to still have a future in the Middle East. At the same time, in the same week, an editorial appeared in Masri al-Yom, a supposedly progressive Egyptian newspaper, authored by a professor of moral philosophy at Zagazig University, arguing that what Egypt needs is the Brazilian solution to its social problems, to unleash its economic growth. And the Brazilian solution was, of course, to exterminate all street children in Egypt. That was what was holding back the country. Now, this, of course, dates as a 20-year discussion about Brazil as a model and counter-model for Egypt dealing with its security problems in the streets. Brazil, since before the times of the Candelaria massacre, when there was a massacre of street children in downtown Rio de Janeiro, which Egypt at that point all its newspapers talked about that massacre and offered an Egyptian solution as the opposite to the Brazil solution, which was, at that time, very radical, which was to give children their own choices, to give loose children or street children their own choices to come and go from centers of education and job creation and empowerment, to not register under, to not have to use their own IDs or register under their family names, in order to basically completely demilitarize pro-citizenship, autonomy-based, agency-based notions of how to deal with the problem of street children in Egypt. That was the Egyptian solution versus the Brazilian solution, as we talked about then. Now we've gone full circle, and after a couple of years in which children led massive sets of protests in Egypt on their own in separate spaces that were not Tahrir. Children took over their own primary schools, kicked out their teachers during 2011 and 12, taught their own classes. These are primary schools. Children, of course, involved in labor unrest. Children meaning to the age of 12. Because above the age, from 12 to 16, you're actually legally allowed to work. So children below the age of 12 make up something like 10 to 15% of the industrial and manufacturing labor class in Egypt. If you include people up to 18, that can jump up to 50% of the actual people doing hard jobs in Egypt. Now, this is not unusual. We know that children in the United States work harder than anybody to accumulate cultural capital, doing constant classes, constant chess teams, constant soccer matches, constantly memorizing. Even their video games are educational. So children laboring is the norm. They labor more than probably adults do in all contexts. But in terms of the dirty work, yes, children are up to 50% of the laboring class. So why shouldn't they have grievances that they express by taking over their spaces, by taking over their streets, by the fact that children are mostly the delivery boys and girls, the shop boys and girls, bringing supplies back and forth, completing the supply chains from Chinese salespeople to manufacturers to delivery people. These are children that are doing these jobs. So they know the streets, they know the connections, they know how the economies link together. So when they take over streets, why do we, even social scientists, just think, oh, this is a crazy nuisance, what's going on here, or is this, they're not legible as social movements. But in Egypt in 2012 and 13, they became insistently legible as social movements as they joined forces with the ultras, soccer fan clubs, which explicitly attacked the police state, burned down police stations and security stations, surrounded military checkpoints, stopped entire highways from circulating, not Tahrir Square, but highways, metro stations, shopping malls, things that remind me a lot of some of the children and adolescent movements in Brazil that take over shopping malls, or the Astões in the beaches and zones like that. Egyptian children were doing things like that as well. So what I talk about in the longer paper is the way that those advocates for the children themselves and the iconographies they use, such as SpongeBob, whereas the youth of 20 and 30-year-olds use V for Vendetta as their kind of icon. As children use SpongeBob, and this kind of use of SpongeBob and the fatwas and the Salafist mobilizations against SpongeBob as gay, and the children are... But then you have this constant placement of, if you see on the upper right, this kind of like military love, like this kind of I'm in love with the military, and then SpongeBob is like, yeah, right, fuck you. And then, SpongeBob is voting for the Egyptian constitution. This is in Rabaa al-Adawiya. This is in the occupation of the Muslim Brotherhood in that square. Even the Muslim Brotherhood, when they wanted to keep their children happy and entertained during this long occupation, they brought the two queerest, most anarchic figures, Barney and SpongeBob, to sing and dance during the Muslim Brotherhood rallies. This is in Rabaa al-Adawiya 2 days before the massacre that killed them all. So, this is the current political system in Egypt as it's been mapped by the current social movement coalition. So these are real protagonists, and this is a horribly blurry presentation, but they have real economic grievances. They have been leaders in particular tactical interventions that have occupied streets and occupied schools and occupied police stations, but they're constantly looked at, even by many of the activists themselves, as a kind of aberration, as a perversion, as an embarrassment, not taken seriously on their own terms as activists. And of course, constantly I challenge myself, we challenge ourselves, why we're so self-conscious. There must be something perverse in me that is making you romanticize the child and take them seriously. Because we're constantly being acted. The books that have been written about street children in Egypt that develop this Egyptian model, that's a model of empowerment versus the Brazilian model of extermination, as it's understood in Egypt. Those people have, every single one of them has been put in jail. The man Kamal Fahmy, who had his NGO closed, and he was arrested as a sex predator. Recently, just this year, a woman who was also had an empowerment organization for children, was arrested as a terrorist for training children to be soldiers to overthrow the Sisi government. These are the paintings of murals of martyred children that have died during protests. All right, so I got to finish. So there you go. So during the inauguration of Sisi, you had another kind of right-wing children's movement, children marching with boots of the military strapped to their head, saying, yes, we want the dictator, we want military power to return to Egypt. So children's movements are not univocal. Resistance amongst children is not contained within our apparatus of progress, right? They are unruly and they can spill from right to left. But I think the lesson that I want to argue for is that we need to take seriously the particular spaces and temporalities of children's movement and try to allow new forms of legibility to arise in which we get beyond the focus on a particular youth anarchic form of agency and see the structural, social, and cultural conditions that can allow for children's movements and their radicalism to be appreciated and for us to find solidarity with them. Thank you very much.
We'll now have Zakia Salim from Rutgers University, who will work to set up the technology here and will then speak on new feminism as personal revolutions, micro-rebellious bodies.